So I have with me Kelly Mitchell, who is the Executive Director of the Robina Institute, and I have Professor JaneAnne Murray. And for Mental Health Awareness Week, we are discussing the intersection of the criminal justice system and mental health care and mental illness. And it is a prevalent issue, and I'll just jump right in. So first of all, how does mental illness make someone more vulnerable to the criminal justice system at the various levels? So there's the charging level, the sentencing level, within the prison system, getting out of the prison system. What does that overlap look like?
Well, obviously, it plays a role in each of the aspects of the criminal legal system. With respect to charging, very often 911 calls can involve somebody with a mental illness in crisis. And because our police show up in their full regalia with their guns drawn, treating this as often as sort of a criminal situation or a potential criminal situation or a volatile situation that could lead to injury, very often the force used and the process involved can, in fact, rather than diffuse the situation, result in the person being arrested. Once you are in the system with a significant mental illness, the problem is that our jails are not really set up to handle these individuals well. Psychologists may not be on duty, psychiatrists may not be around, there's nobody to give prescribed medication. Then you're going to find that the person's medication is interrupted and they may end up then having some kind of episode as a result of non-medication, which can result in them being put in solitary, perhaps not getting bail, perhaps being deemed incompetent and being, not even getting their case presented to a judge effectively, but removed from the system. And then when we get to sentencing, there could be so many aspects of the mental illness that have aggravated the situation that they're in. It could have led to prior convictions in the past that magnified the sentences they face. Certainly, I think judges are more and more becoming cognizant of the impact of mental illness. And so that's one area where perhaps the situation could prove to the benefit of an individual that their mental illness will be taken into account in giving a more lenient sentence. The other aspect that can happen just before that is the competency hearing. And, there was a study done in Minneapolis a couple of years ago that showed just how, the number of people who were found to be incompetent, but it turned out never got any mental health services. I think it was like an unbelievable statistic, like 60%. So we're dealing with the huge problem that the mental health services are inadequate, and we have a large portion of mentally ill individuals who are going through our criminal justice system in many ways in contexts where they should have been diverted completely.
So I do want to pick up on one thing, so on the one hand, the one possibility for the criminal justice system is that it could play a positive role in that it might give us an opportunity to intervene with that individual, right? So if mental illness is driving their criminal behavior and we have jurisdiction over that person, then maybe we can get them the treatment that they need. Although, as Professor Murray pointed out, we often don't have the level of services, out there that could adequately address the problem. But she also talked about incompetency, and this is where Minnesota especially has a gap, in that there are individuals who are found to be incompetent to stand trial. So that means their case can't go forward, but they also are not mentally ill enough to be committed to receive treatment through civil, Department of Health and Services, through civil procedures. So what happens is it's a gap. We call it a gap. They get left in that gap and they don't receive services at all. We don't have jurisdiction on the criminal side to provide the treatment. And we also don't have jurisdiction on the civil side to help them provide treatment. And so these individuals just kind of end up cycling back through the system over and over again, because it's like this constant cycle of they need help, they can't They can't participate in their criminal defense. They can't be civilly committed. There's no mechanism for us to give them treatment. They're not seeking treatment on their own. So the cycle repeats itself.
That sort of ties me into my other question, which is some people might argue that there are people who have severe enough mental illnesses that when they do get this exposure to treatment through the criminal justice system, you might hear an argument that it's like, well, you know, at least they're getting care. But what would you say is the problem with allowing the criminal justice system or the prison and jail system? What is the problem with letting those institutions take over public health programs or proactive mental health outreach?
Well, the problem, of course, is that the prisons and the jails just aren't equipped to provide the kind of service that these individuals need. They need intensive therapeutic, medicinal intervention, and the medical staff in the jails and the prisons just aren't equipped to handle it. And so very often you're just going to end up with tranquilizing drugs, for example, or placement in solitary confinement, which of course aggravates any potential mental health episode, because that's just so isolating and terrifying to the individuals involved.
And you know, let's think about why the criminal justice system exists and what their goals are. And it's to prosecute crime and to, you know, I mean, a lot of people would say it's retributive. The goal is punishment. The goal is somebody has committed a crime and we're here to mete out the appropriate punishment for that crime. There's a lot of people who say it's rehabilitative. It should be rehabilitative as well, that we should intervene and help rehabilitate the individuals so that they don't come back into the system. But I'd say in application, we're more retributive. And that is not the type of system that you want controlling your mental health services. So really what we should be aiming for is, why is the mental health service not there before the crime happens? You know, what could we do to make those services available to people who can't pay for them? I mean, that, you know, criminal justice becomes the place where people who can't afford to pay for the services get the services by default because it's the only thing we've got, right? So somehow we need to shift the system so that we have those services available for people to access voluntarily, but also access them even if they can't pay for them.
Right. I mean, it goes back to the Reagan era when mental hospitals were closed. And I mean, these places were little more than prisons themselves, but at least they were facilities that were geared to diagnose these issues and treat serious mental disorders. They were not pleasant places. It's sort of, you can see why they got closed, but what happened is we didn't open something else in the alternative. And so this is where the funneling into the criminal justice system occurred.
Speaking of inability to pay for these services, looking at this issue from sort of an intersectionality perspective, there are lots of things, lots of identity factors to a person beyond just mental illness. But how does the criminal justice system target people who are not just mentally ill, but also are of minority classes or underrepresented classes? So how does something like race, ethnicity, gender, sexuality, class, income, immigration status, how does this all overlap with making somebody with a mental illness more vulnerable to the criminal justice system?
I was just going to say that, you know, it comes into how bias occurs. You know, so let's just take a person who is Black, because a lot of Black men are people who are caught up in the criminal justice system. So if a Black man is acting out then that individual is going to be seen as a more violent, personality. But that man might be acting out of mental illness. There might be other causes. Sometimes even it's just health issues. There might be underlying health issues that have been unaddressed that are sort of leading to this behavior that is being perceived as, violent, or just I'm not thinking of the right word, but basically, not civilized behavior, right? It's being perceived that way because he is Black. And if a white person was doing the same thing, then the thought might first be, maybe there's something wrong, like maybe this person needs some help, right? And so the response is more criminal in nature, and it's racially driven. So we have these stereotypes about what people of particular races act like and look like, and those biases really result in the way we respond to them, and more people who are non-white are pulled into the criminal justice system, and then we start to work with them, and then we realize, wow, this person has anxiety, severe anxiety, and that is driving their behavior. Or wow, this person has some other mental illness that's driving their behavior, and if only they had gotten help sooner, they wouldn't be here today. So I think that's how the two are interrelated.
Right. And just to follow up on your comments, Kelly, obviously we have a complete shortage of mental health services generally across this country, a massive shortage, and it's much more privileged people get access to these services. There's a lot of documented data that individuals in poorer socioeconomic communities and communities of color are getting no services at all. So this feeds into Kelly's point that you may end up getting a large percentage of people of color, very poor people who never received the services and never received the diagnoses, ending up in the criminal legal system because their behavior was misinterpreted, or perhaps they were having a mental health episode, or that was misinterpreted, or there was such a strong police response to a 911 call that it escalated out of control. Certainly that drives the disparities that we have in the prisons. I mean, there's statistically apparently 4.5% serious mental illnesses in the general population. But in prisons, estimates vary, but anywhere up to 25% of people in prisons and jails can have serious mental illnesses. So we can really see through those statistics how the criminal legal system becomes the fallback for mental health treatment.
That sort of leads me into another question, which is that a lot of the focus is on the treatment and care or supervision of people with mental illnesses within jails and prisons. But as recently as 2020, roughly 800,000 people were under correctional supervision of some type from the criminal justice system, and also had a serious mental illness. So looking at things like probation and parole and supervision by the courts outside of prisons, how does that sort of tie into the role criminal justice plays in mental health care?
It's the hidden population, right? I mean, the reality is that there are more people on probation and parole than there are in prisons and jails across this country, because that is a default response. If it's not prison, we got to do something. So we're going to place the person on probation, or even after prison, we're going to keep them under supervision and on parole for a while. And, the upside of parole, community supervision has an upside in that it is supposed to be more rehabilitative. The idea of community supervision is that we want people to be in the community because then they can carry on with their lives and they can, be productive members of society, but also because that's where the services actually are. They're not in prisons and jails. If there are going to be services anywhere, it's going to be in the community. So it is a more effective mechanism for making services available, but the downside is those services tend to be really widely available in urban areas, but not rural areas. So, here in the Twin Cities, we probably are the land of 10,000 community services. You could sort of cut it any way. Think about any particular population, any intersectional population. We probably have it covered in Minneapolis and St. Paul. But now let's go out to Crookston or Wilmer or Lake of the Woods, Minnesota. We don't have it covered out there. But we have the same needs and services, and mental illness is not geographically restricted to the urban area. So it gets a lot harder to deliver those services evenly throughout the state. And I would say that for all of the lack of mental health services we might even have in the Twin Cities, because as Professor Murray explained before, we haven't actually replaced that system very effectively. It's even less available in the rural areas. So we have to keep that in mind too.
Yeah, I suppose that leads me into my last question, which is obviously there are a lot of levels at which we can change the way that people with mental illnesses go through and have contact with the criminal justice system. There's the legislative level, the judicial level, by law enforcement within prisons and jails, by public health institutions and agencies, and at the societal level. And obviously each one comes with their own benefits and downsides. But what are some changes or recommendations that you would suggest are key places to look as we seek to rectify this issue?
Well, I'll start here. Obviously, we could have interventions at every point in the system, and so I'll suggest a couple, and I know that Professor Mitchell will have a bunch to add. The first is the actual first encounter. Often the encounter of somebody with a mental illness with the criminal justice system is because a loved one called 911 and they were in a crisis. And as I said earlier, this often results in an overly aggressive and armed response from the police. There are programs across the country, like one in Eugene, Oregon, where if it is determined to be a mental health crisis that's at issue, the people dispatched will be a paramedic and a social worker to address the situation with no police, or maybe police in the background as a backup. I may be wrong, but I feel like I just saw a headline in the Star Tribune the other day saying that EMS in Minneapolis does not wish to be responding to these calls without police assistance. But this brings in the kind of the movement to reform police, and I think it was labeled, I think, unfortunately, defund the police, but the idea was we don't need this level of police presence responding to issues that could turn into public safety issues, when we could have de-escalators like social workers and trained medical staff responding to the situation. It's not that we don't want police there and that we don't need police protecting our community, but that sometimes police can actually generate public safety problems by their presence when other professionals could diffuse the situation. That's just one area where we could have an intervention, and I will leave it to Professor Mitchell to add some of the others, and I can come back and talk maybe about training of defense counsel.
Yeah, I would just say, I go back to what I said before, which is like my dream, my if I could change anything about the world kind of statement would be, let's figure out a way to have a walk-in clinic where anyone could go. before they get involved in the criminal justice system. Like, how can we provide the services up front, and why do you have to be involved in the criminal justice system to access them? Like, we have the services, let's find a mechanism to let people access them before they get into trouble. That would be the ideal. But another intervention point, I've been working recently with Ramsey County on probation revocations. We've just finished up a big project there. And one of the things that we learned through our research in that county is that, you know, people are lacking all kinds of basic needs, you know, housing, you know, food support, mental illness, you know, mental health treatment, you know, that sort of thing. So one of the things we've been talking about in Ramsey as a potential intervention is to have sort of a wellness assessment at the same time that they're doing intake for probation. And so that is your social worker who's involved in intake along with the probation officer, trying to figure out what does this person actually need and how can we leverage the resources we have in the county to build the support around that person so that they can be more successful. Mental health is a piece of that equation. It's not everything they need, but it's definitely a piece of that equation. And that's hard. Those are systems that don't work together very well. You know, they have a lot of discussions to do about whose responsibility is it, who's on first, you know, that sort of thing. But they're definitely interested in having those discussions and trying to work through those problems so that they can, you know, use the services they already have, but more effectively.
Yeah, and we could also have a situation with the criminal legal system whereby if, in fact, that is the entry point for the individual involved, that the system can be designed not to hit them with a criminal conviction when it's determined that their criminal behavior, the offense that brought them in, is directly related, substantially related to their mental illness diagnosis. And so you can have situations where they get a stay of execution and ultimately the case gets dismissed while they go through treatment services. This is the model that exists in mental health courts. It's just something that we can expand and involve a lot more individuals and a lot more offenses. This idea that, well, we've got our hands on you now and we can use this as an opportunity for treatment, but we also don't want to end up punishing you with a criminal conviction and all the collateral consequences that go with that. Connected with that, of course, would involve training our professionals in the criminal legal system, so our defense attorneys and our prosecutors, on the nature of mental illness, recognizing it, the appropriate treatment mechanisms, and being willing to explore non-custodial and non-conviction alternatives in contexts where we have a clear diagnosis.
Absolutely. Yeah, I think that's a good place to conclude, but thank you both so much. I really appreciate it. And this is a very important topic, and it's important to keep it in the conversation in the legal community and society at large. And thank you again for your time. I really appreciate it.
Okay, thank you for having us. Thank you.